appointed, I think that's just recording going on. I was going to just cover that off in the Zoom protocols. But yes, the hearings panel comprising 4 independent commissioners have been appointed by the panel to hear all submissions and make recommendations on submissions received by the council on the proposed New Plymouth District Plan. We've all worked in and around New Zealand for our career, and there is a schedule of interests that sits on the website that we've declared, and we've managed some hearing processes around some of those aspects. So one of the things that I do request at the start of each hearing, and you can do this in the introduction and appearances section, if there's any issues that any party perceives with us being able to independently hear these matters in hearing 4, please speak up at the start, and we'll deal with those issues if they arise. The other thing is, as with the hearings face-to-face, we do expect a high level of conduct and standards from people presenting. The same rules will apply, that if there is any disruption or matters that arise which don't fall within our feeling around good conduct and respect, we will be implementing the same sorts of processes we are able to just in face-to-face hearings. All right, so I'll just move through some Zoom protocols for everybody. As most of you have, pretty much all of you have done, except for Julie and Kit, which is appropriate, please turn off your both your mics and your videos if you're not participating. I will not be using the old hand signal technique because we've just got too many people here to proceed on that basis. But if you do want to speak or raise some issues with me or Commissioner Littlejohn, please just turn your video on and your microphone on, and we'll sort of see you and hear you, and we'll deal with that as it arises. But again, we won't be expecting too much interruption unless there's a very key point to note that you'd like us to consider. Certainly no cross-examination allowed from any party. Chats can be directed to Julie, our hearings administrator, who can then let the commissioners Kit and I know something to be aware of by text. So if there's some procedural issues happening, we'll keep in touch with Julie by text just off to the side. If you are having problems with technology, I know some of you are in remoter areas where broadband may be not as strong, and it gets too difficult, just drop out and advise Julie by email that you have, and she can organise some alternative arrangements. So maybe by way of a deferral or some other way we can proceed without you. The Zoom will be recorded, as it is in all hearings. So if you miss something, the council can make that part of the hearing available. Right, those were my introductions. Does anyone have any questions on any of the matters I've raised? Okay, doesn't look like, so that's all good. I would like to note appearances, and this is going to be interesting how we do this. I can see a lot of people's names up there, but perhaps we could start with the council's planning officers, the Section 42A officers, just introduce yourselves, say who you are and what matter you're covering. That would be good. Thank you.
Morning. So Hamish Wisney, I co-authored the Light Section 42 report with Erica, and co-authored the Noise Section 42A report with Holly.
Hello everyone, I am Holly Gardner. I co-authored the Noise report with Hamish Wisney.
Good morning, I'm Erica Jane. As Hamish mentioned, I co-authored the Light report with Hamish.
Thank you, Erica.
Good morning, my name's Nicola Lawrenson and I have written the Section 42A report for the Earthworks chapter.
Thank you, Nicola.
Ata Maria, I'm Ali Gibson and I'm a contract planning advisor in the Council's District Plan team. I'm the author of the Section 42A report for signs.
Thank you, Ali.
Kia ora tātou, everyone. My name's Dermot Fringley and I am the author of the Temporary Activities Section 42A report. Cheers.
Cheers, Dermot.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Nigel Lloyd. I advise council. I'm an independent acoustic consultant and I advise council on the noise issues.
Thank you, Nigel. Perhaps Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself? I see you there just before we get on to the submitters.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah Edwards and I am the District Plan Lead at New Plymouth District Council.
Thanks, Sarah. Is there anyone else from Council online, Sarah, that we need to introduce?
No, not that I can see.
Thank you. And look, the one submitter that we are programmed to hear today is the Department of Conservation. So perhaps the DOC team could introduce yourselves with an appearance now.
Yes, hello, Graham Taylor from Department of Conservation based down here in Wellington, and I'll be talking about the impact of light pollution and light issues on seabirds.
Great, thanks, Graham.
Susan. Kia ora, Susan Newell here. I'm the solicitor with the Department of Conservation. Sorry, I'm unable to get my camera to work at the moment, so I'll see what I can do about that.
All good,
as we go on.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Kia ora, I'm Stephanie McNichol. I'm the Senior RMA Planner for DOC, talking on the lighting provisions today.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. All right, I think now in terms of order, I might just call some names out as I see them and we'll see who we end up with. So Keith from Ngāti Rahiriri, can you say hello? Here we go.
Kia ora, everybody. Keith Holswich, representing Ngāti Rahiriri. We will be submitting on day 3, noise and earthworks. Thank you.
Thank you. So Zen, I can see you there. Can you just say hello?
Oh, hi, I'm Zen. I'm from Landpro. I'm just here to observe the district plan hearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, Mr. Campbell, Michael, I can see you there. No, Michael. Yeah, here he is.
Michael Campbell, High Order. We're here for principally earthworks and noise, and I think the rest is attending the 30th of August session with our noise has been deferred.
Thank you, Michael. Your audio is not that flash, so might be worth something checking on as we go. Wade Lobb. Can you just say hello there?
Hi, I'm Wade. I support the council with GIS. So I'm just going to be watching in probably till about lunchtime. Then I'll be signing off.
Thank you very much, Wade. Damien, see you there next.
Morning, everybody. Damien Ellerton, Marshall Day Acoustics. I'll be presenting evidence on behalf of Energy Resources Aotearoa and Marshall Day Acoustics as a company, separate but obviously very similar bodies of evidence. Thank you.
Thank you, Damien. Sean.
Kia ora, Sean Zulchers, Project Manager, Taranaki Maunga Project today. So here to observe and listen to the evidence of my DOC colleagues. Kia ora.
Christine, do you want to say hello? I can see you there.
Good morning, everybody. Yes, Christine Brummel from the Working at the Council, and I assist Julie with the administration of the hearings.
Thank you. Dean Raymond, I can see you next.
Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Dean Raymond's my name. I'm a hearing. I'll be presenting some evidence on earthworks and.
Okay, Dean, thanks. Just signalling your both your video and audio is a little bit hairy there, so maybe have a look at that. And you might be in a remote area, but just let us know if you struggle, as I said, when you come to present. Hilary Walker.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Actually, let me see if I can get my video. Yeah, good morning, everyone. I work for Federated Farmers. We're speaking on Monday, next Monday, so I think that's day 4. So just here really observing today.
Thank you, Hilary. Nice to see you again. Chris Marsh.
Kia ora, Chris Marsh. Chris Marsh here, Ngāti Waihiri, just observing for today.
Like your teddy bear, Chris. Casey Bellamy.
Tēnā koutou, my name is Casey Bellamy. I will be presenting evidence on day 3 on behalf of Te Koteitanga o Te Atiawa Trust in relation to the noise, light, signs and temporary activities chapters.
Thank you, Casey, and welcome. Right, who haven't I got? Sarah Marco, I can see too.
Tēnā tātou, ko Sarah Makotoku ingoa, he pautai au ki Te Koteitanga o Te Atiawa Trust. So presenting evidence for Te Koteitanga on Wednesday morning.
Thank you, Sarah. Maria.
Kia ora koutou, ko Maria Hokapura tōku ingoa, he tau mō te kāhui o Taranaki Iwi Trust. Kia ora, I'm Maria. I'm going to be presenting evidence on Wednesday as well regarding earthworks on behalf of te kāhui o Taranaki. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Maria. Right, I'm not, the name on the screen is GSRLL, so could GSRLL just introduce yourself?
Yeah, Gary Riley from Methanex. Sorry about that, GSRLL. Not sure why it's come up like that. Just observing, have interest in the Motunui plant noise and the Omata tank farm, but don't have any evidence to present.
Yeah. Gary, just to let you and everyone know, I'm standing aside for the Methanex submissions, and I think we've got Commissioner Coffin set up to consider and make recommendations on your particular issues alongside Commissioner Littlejohn. It's just that our firm does act for Methanex, so that's one of the matters we've managed through our hearing protocols. So nice to see you, Gary. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stephen.
Yep. Kath is there next.
Kia ora koutou, Kathy Bothwaite. I'm planning consultant for Waka Kotahi. I'm just here to listen today and I'll be presenting evidence Monday next week. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Gurv Singh.
Kia ora, koe Gurv taku ingoa, Gurv Singh from Kainga Ora. Thank you.
Welcome, Gurv. Jennifer. We can't hear you, Jennifer.
Is that any better?
Yep, that's good.
Nice. Good morning. Jennifer Carville. I'm presenting planning evidence on behalf of Greymouth Petroleum tomorrow morning.
Welcome, Jennifer. Steve Much.
Good morning, sir. My name is Steve Much. I'm counsel for Greymouth Petroleum Limited, presenting tomorrow morning.
Welcome, Steve.
Thank you.
And Jeremy Brophy, you're the last I can see. So hello, Jeremy.
Kia ora koutou, Jeremy Brophy here from BTW Company. I'm just observing this morning and we'll be presenting planning evidence on Wednesday morning for Southern Cross Hospital and Blue Haven Commercial.
Cool, thanks, Jeremy. Have I missed anyone off? Okay, looks like we've got everyone. Thank you for those introductions. There might be someone just coming on there. Lucy Edwards. No, okay. So I'll go back to speaker view and I think Sarah Edwards, it's perhaps your turn, or just, I think I've asked for any questions, so we'll probably move past that. Sarah, I think you had a couple of procedural matters you wanted to raise with us first. Perhaps
Yes.
it's the time to do that now.
Yes, thank you and good morning, commissioners and submitters. As I've said, my name is Sarah Edwards and I'm the District Plan Lead at New Plymouth District Council. Shortly you will hear the introductory comments from the reporting planners on the noise, light, earthworks signs and temporary activities 42A reports. I will leave it to those planners to introduce themselves. But before we start, I have two procedural matters that I would like to raise, and these relate to notification of submissions that have resulted in consequential amendments and also the notification of deferred submissions. So turning to the submissions that have resulted in consequential amendments. As part of hearings 1 and 2, reporting officers recommended that a number of submission points be accepted, which require subsequent consideration as to whether consequential amendments need to be made to other chapters. Moving through the hearing process, each 42A report will note the original submission resulting in the consequential amendment and make a recommendation or recommendations as to whether changes need to be made to that chapter. The submitter has already been notified of the recommendation to accept their submission point and that a reporting planner will consider any consequential amendments in other chapters. Therefore, the submitter will not be subsequently notified in relation to the consequential changes to other chapters that may result from their submission point. In terms of notification of deferred submissions, in some Section 42A reports, reporting officers have made the recommendation to defer consideration of a submission point to another chapter hearing. In these cases, the submitter will be informed through the Section 42A report that their submission point has been deferred to another hearing. When the deferred submission point is due to be heard later in the hearing process, the submitter will again be informed of the applicable chapter hearing and when the 42A report has been released.
Thank you for that, Sarah. A couple of questions arising for me and the commissioners. Just keeping track of those consequential amendments and deferral matters, is it your intention to keep a schedule of those that might be available, that would be available to us as decision makers, just so we know what the linkages are?
Yes, there is. We are tracking all the consequential amendments, submissions that have resulted in consequential amendments, as well as the deferred submission points in an Excel spreadsheet. So if it pleases the hearing panel, we can provide a summarised version of that so that you can see when these changes have occurred and when they will come up in subsequent chapters.
Okay. Do you think that might be able to be in a form that could be kept sort of a live update on the website to help submitters? Because I think that
certainly
would be very, very helpful.
Certainly, no problem. We're just in the process of making that in a more user-friendly format so people can see that and it's open and transparent.
Perfect. Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks for raising those matters. It's certainly something that's been on my mind, just with the range of matters that we've either agreed to be deferred on application or you're recommending as the planning team. And I think this just keeps everything nice and tidy and people are aware of how we're rolling through. So thank you very much for that, Sarah. Are there any other matters you'd like to raise before? I do have a couple of procedural matters myself. So anything else from you?
No, that's it from me.
All right. So I think the two matters I'd like to raise, just for everyone's information. The first one relates to our interim guidance in relation to hearings 1 and 2, strategic direction objectives, and in relation to the plan's structure and format. We have released our interim guidance that's available under the minutes section of the council's website or dedicated website for the proposed district plan. Just to note two things, we won't be entering into any, and we say this in the minute, any dialogue offline out of the hearings on that interim guidance, and it's clearly set out the status of the guidance and how that has come about and what our tentative views are on those chapters. Are not recommendations for us or decisions from the council, or they don't bind us or anyone else in the procedures. I just wanted to signal that. But during the specific hearings on the district-wide chapters and the area-specific chapters, we are certainly interested in how those strategic direction objectives relate and interact with the objectives, policies, rules, and other methods. And certainly Sarah and the council team and submitters that are listening into this discussion, feel free to refer to those and interweave and interrelate those into your advice to us as we move along, and we'll certainly reconsider any further evidence we have in those forums as we look towards making final recommendations at the end of the process. So any questions on that from any of the parties?
Stephen,
Yes.
Stephen, could I just make a comment there? I don't want parties to think that we are shy about our interim guidance and that they should feel relaxed about referring to it in the course of evidence if they wish to emphasise a point they are making, or even be critical, not to the point of well, of course you can be critical of it in the context of giving evidence. For example, if you think that because of an issue that you're raising in an area, a specific matter needs to be somehow reflected, or there needs to be some adjustment at the strategic direction level, then you should feel free to refer that to us. I mean, we're not that shy and precious about the interim guidance that we don't want it to be talked about at all, because it does have to flow through the entire plan, and we're all interested in making sure it's all integrated and consistent.
Thank you, Kit. Right. The other matter we did want to signal at the start was a plan structure issue that Commissioner Littlejohn would like to just signal at the start of today's hearing about a matter. So, Kit, I'll hand over to you to just introduce your thinking on that.
Yeah, okay. Well, this is the first hearing where we've actually delved into the structure of the chapters and how they are intending to set out the objective, policy and method framework for managing activities. And they follow the very lean formula that the NPS suggests that they ought to follow, which is all well and good. One of the aspects of the plan structure that I have a few concerns about, and wish to just raise it at the outset without necessarily getting everyone to provide an answer, is the way in which the assessment criteria, the way in which the matters of discretion for the restricted discretionary activities are cast. And I haven't had a chance to talk to our self-confessed planning geek on the hearing panel, so this may be an overly legalistic approach to it. But the way in which some of the assessment matters are cast does not immediately enable them to assist a decision maker to determine whether or not consent ought to be granted, or what consent conditions might be about. And so I wanted to raise it from the outset, and I think the statement of matters of discretion is mandatory in the context of restricted discretionary activities, and the only real guidance the Act gives us on these creatures is in section 104C, which essentially says that these matters are things that ought to be used by a decision maker to approve or reject an application, and if approving, they are the things about which conditions can be crafted. And my experience with the expression of matters of discretion from other plans is that they are relatively straightforward statements about effects of the proposal or particular aspects that are relevant to whether or not discretion ought to be exercised and conditions granted and conditions imposed. They are to be contrasted by these other creatures which are not mandatory but have become conventional in most modern plans, these things called assessment criteria. And assessment criteria, if you go to the quality planning website, are a slightly different creature, and indeed the quality planning website suggests that the best assessment criteria are actually the policies of your plan, because they're already there. But that doesn't stop councils from writing lots of assessment criteria. And the key difference between them is that assessment criteria are phrased as evaluative or provocative statements. They are things that consent applicants and decision makers and consent processes will ask about a proposal to determine whether or not it's appropriate in the context of what's provided for. And so the quality planning website says you should start these things with phrases like the extent to which, the ability to which, whether the, so these very sort of evaluative, non-directional statements, which I see most of the assessment matters that are listed in the new Plymouth District Plan rules, they adopt that sort of formula, which is perfectly acceptable. The difficulty I'm having, though, is the ability to which those statements can be used by a decision maker to determine whether consent ought to be granted or not, and how to cast conditions of consent. And that's because the way in which they're phrased is quite evaluative and don't really give a clear statement. So, I mean, I've looked at a number of other plans, and they take the approach of separating matters of discretion from assessment criteria for that very reason, because sometimes the language can't do both. And so I'll be honest and say I struggled with the phrasing of these matters of discretion in all of the 5 chapters that we've looked at. Some of them are matters of discretion, and yet others are assessment criteria. And I want council staff and any other experts who are going to be giving evidence to us to reflect on this. And I don't think it's a fatal problem. I think it's potentially a way in which they are formatted and framed. And I really just want to invite the parties to consider the issue, to see whether to see whether I'm just being overly legalistic, and that these things that we've called matters of discretion can function both as assessment criteria and as matters of discretion. And if so, then provide me with a bit of comfort that they're not going to end up confusing people in the future. So I just thought I'd get that out there at the outset, because they are really the engine room for much of the rules that the council has chosen, with many activities pushed into the restricted discretionary space. So we've got to have them working very functional. The other aspect about them, which I just wanted to raise as well, is that there is rarely any matter of discretion that refers to the positive effects of the activity. Now, we might all think that that's just to be taken for granted, but of course the case law around restricted discretionary matters is that you've got to very much stick to the square box that the matters of discretion carve out for the decision maker. And I note, and not wanting to use the Auckland example, but using the Auckland example, they have a particular general rule that sits right at the outset, which says that just because a matter of discretion does not reference positive effects of an activity doesn't mean that they're not relevant. So they've taken the approach of inserting that as a cross-plan proposition for all restricted discretionary activities, simply to cure that potential absence. So that was the issue that I thought it would be helpful to raise at the outset. I don't know if it needs to distract us too much through the course of the hearing, but I think it's something that we would like to come back to at the end of hearing 4, just to see what the considered view of the parties is on this, whether we need to do anything about it, and if so, how we might do that in the course of going through all of the hearings on these chapters, because this is an issue that will go through all of the chapters from here on in. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Littlejohn. So look, that's something that Commissioner Littlejohn and I have been pondering while we've been reading the material. I think the way forward here would be, and this is something that's perhaps a bit novel, but Julie, I think we'll, because Kit's relayed that so clearly in an oral way, we should perhaps either get that written up and issued to the parties here as his train of thought, just so that when we are asking questions about this through this hearing as a bit of a test, planners and legal counsel can have a think about that, and certainly other parties as well. So we'll think about that through today, how we might just frame that up. The other option, we might just put up the video link just with Kit's explanation here, which I think
Don't do that.
I find pretty useful. So look, we'll talk about that.
Stephen, can I just, these are sort of very side issues, but I wanted to, rather than start to address them one-on-one with the Section 42A writers, there's two matters I wanted to raise, and it's something that the 42A writers can comment on when they answer or give a brief intro. The first is coming back to this restricted discretionary theme. It's not immediately clear to me the status of an activity that fails to comply with one of the effects standards. So you'll see it's quite clear in the rules. You have activity status where compliance not achieved, and you have RDIS, and then you do what the MPS says, and you have the matters of discretion. Where it gets to the effects standards, in the third column, all we see is a matters of discretion if compliance is not achieved. Now, I mean, I assume that the status of an activity that does not comply with the particular effect standards becomes restricted discretionary. And I'm just wondering whether it's clear enough leaving it like that, or whether it's sufficient to have, for example, activity status where the artificial light complies with S1, and then have just the default to RDIS recognized there. So that's more of just a cross-referencing matter. Do we need that as a signal? Probably not, but I just wanted to see if we're going to make this as user-friendly as possible, just to clarify that a failure to achieve a particular standard makes the activity restricted discretionary. And then the other one was one of the cross-referencing submissions that has been carried through in all of the 42A reports is the reference to the strategic objectives right at the outset before the objectives and policies. And just looking at all of the 5 42A reports and the appendices 1 to each of those reports, each of the 5 reporting officers adopt a slightly different formula to achieve that cross-referencing. And I think it's just something that I don't think we're saying we don't think the cross-referencing is appropriate, but I just would like the authors to reflect on the different way in which each of them have expressed the cross-reference. Some have a subheading, some have it under a subheading cross-reference to other relevant district plan provisions. Some then also have the statement, in addition, other district-wide, and some chapters may contain provisions that may be relevant. So I just want to think if we're going to aim for a consistent cross-reference, then we should all agree on what that cross-reference is going to be and how it's going to be worded. So that was the only other matter. That I only raised it because it crosses all 5 reports. That's all.
Thank you very much. So before we kick off with the 42A reporters, I'll probably come back to Sarah. It was just for an initial just feedback on something that we've landed on you at the start of the hearing. Look, there was one other procedural matter which I do need a signal at the start of the hearing. We've been noticing a pattern of some submitters who are providing expert evidence and other evidence which is in opposition to the position taken by the Council's 42 officers and is in the context of opinion evidence and submissions seeking other outcomes. We find that process unsatisfactory and contrary to our expectations in the hearing procedures. We're all about hearing the matters, and hearing means actually hearing. So for those parties who are in the categories in the website of evidence or submissions but not appearing at the hearing, we will be issuing a minute probably later today requesting and directing that those types of parties who are particularly presenting expert evidence do make themselves available for hearing during these procedures going forward. We're certainly aware that for some parties and matters which may not be mission critical for a submitter, that the cost of flying in and out of New Plymouth is a reason why that practice might be being pursued. But with the Zoom platform available, and I think I've accepted all the Zoom requests that have been made with reasons to date, we do expect to hear from submitters and particularly expert witnesses who are presenting a position that is contestable in terms of the advice we're getting from our Section 42A officers in the process. So that minute will be issued, and Julie, I'll be asking you to issue that to parties in this hearing number 4 and all the other parties when it's released. Having said that, we do find it acceptable that where a party, either through a submission or a statement of evidence, records acceptance of the positions taken by the Section 42 officers and the recommendations, that's clearly acceptable to us to be filed as a written statement. And for the record, we find that very helpful. So thank you very much for that. And probably with the matters raised by Commissioner Littlejohn, before we get into each of the 42A reporters, the 5 of you, or 6 with Mr. Wensley. Ms. Edwards, is there anything you'd like to just respond to us on the matters raised by Commissioner Littlejohn?
Only in that we will go away and consider it. I understand what Commissioner Littlejohn has raised, and we will need to give some consideration to that, and also speak with council's lawyers on that as well to understand how this can be made more user-friendly, and whether there needs to be a change in approach. So yeah, we will definitely seek some advice on that, and we will come back, hopefully with the verbal right of replies, but certainly through the written right of replies.
Yes, that's what we thought. We'd raise it early, give the council team some time to think about the matters raised, and certainly, as Kit said, not issue anything to the wider parties until we've heard the feedback, and then if we need to do a minute or do some procedural process around that, we can do that after this hearing. So it's just a good chance to be able to tease out the questions in real time with these first specific chapters that we are hearing. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
So who's first in terms of the council team? Presume you have an order.
I believe, Commissioner Daish, that would be me. Righty. Good morning, commissioners, submitters, ladies and gentlemen. As noted earlier, my name is Holly Elizabeth Gardner, Consultant Planner for the District Plan team at the New Plymouth District Council. Together with Hamish Wesney, we have considered the submissions on and co-authored the Section 42A report for the noise chapter. We are supported by noise expert for council, Mr. Nigel Lloyd. We note firstly that we do have an addendum to our Section 42A report. This relates to omitted submission points and provides further clarification. I believe, Julie, this will be sent out shortly, just to talk to that addendum. Since publishing our report, we became aware of a couple of errors The first one relates to Appendix 2, the recommended decisions on submissions, and submission point 525.67. This is from Port Taranaki, which was missed in the analysis of submissions in the report. This submission point relates to the port operations being a 24/7 operation, and therefore they consider that noise are features of port operations which cannot be fully internalised. The port seeks and appropriate provisions are included in the district plan relating to noise and the continued operation of the port. Our recommendation regarding submission point 525.67 is that a decision on this point is deferred until the port zone hearing, similar to other such submission points in the report. And this submission point is included in Appendix 2 and Appendix 3. The other area we want to raise in the addendum is relating to Appendix 2 as well. And this is the further submission point 126.288, which is referred to in our report, but it's not included in Appendix 2, although we did check that just recently, and it seems it is included, but we just wanted to raise this for clarification. For the reasons outlined in paragraph 268 of the report, we recommend that this further submission point is rejected. And there's a amended Appendix 2 addendum attached to that addendum, which Julie will send out shortly, if not as we speak. Turning to the overall noise chapter, 40 original submissions and 20 further submissions were received on the noise chapter. And these submissions relate to the following matters: reverse sensitivity effects, activity and location specific provisions, changes or clarification regarding technical matters, including the method of measuring noise, noise limits, and the management of noise effects. Submissions were also received on the general plan structure and interpretation. In our analysis of the submissions in the Section 42A report, we grouped the submissions on the chapter into 12 key issues related to site or activity specific issues such as noise provisions for New Plymouth Airport, noise at manufacturing and processing facilities, through to district-wide matters such as the noise provisions for the rural production zone and the refinement of plan provisions to ensure technical clarity. Having read the pre-circulated evidence in response to the Section 42A report, we consider there to be 5 key issues or areas of contention, and these relate to in rural zones, the point at which noise limits are required to be measured from and complied with, either the notional boundary, the site boundary, or a combination of the two. The setting of noise limits and whether they are too stringent. This largely relates to the noise limits in the rural production zone, but also applies to specific activities, including well sites, major facilities such as the Methanex Motunui plant and New Plymouth Airport. The times at which noise limits are set, for example, whether the noise limits apply during the day, evening, or at night. And primarily the contention there relates to whether there are the 3 split or whether it's just day and night. The noise control boundaries surrounding the Methanex Motunui and Pohukura production plant, and whether the noise control boundary here is combined or remains as Methanex Motunui. And lastly, whether the matters of discretion are specific enough, in particular the matters of discretion relating to construction activities in noise S2 and the rural production zone in noise S1-2. Finally, we wish to correct a minor error in the report, that is regarding the recommendations table at the beginning of section 538, and that relates to key issue 8, noise at manufacturing and processing plant facilities. We have referred to the retention of noise S4-4, This is a typing error, and in fact, the recommendations table should refer to noise S43. If the commissioners have any requests for points of clarification or questions, I'd be happy to answer these now.
Thank you for that introduction, Holly. So just on the addendum, those matters seem to be the first one about the port noise issue. As you say, it's been requested to be deferred, and we've actually made that decision
Yes.
sorry, already. The other one, as you say, just the clarification point is important, and we should get that out obviously as soon as possible, and particularly, yes, Julie, if you could do a specific email just highlighting the addendum to the parties in particular who are affected, that would be good to do as well. So thank you for that. Holly, so I have a couple of questions of you, more about process and timing. The first one is, you've now had the opportunity to read the submitter evidence in relation to your chapter, I take it?
Yes, that's correct.
Are there any particular aspects of that evidence you'd like to highlight to us as issues that are top of mind that we might just think through before we talk to those parties? Obviously, given the fact that you do have a right of reply at the end as well.
Yes,
so
yeah.
Just from a helpful point of view, are there any specific items that you think you'd like to us to explore in particular?
I think the key ones that come to mind probably firstly are, as Commissioner Littlejohn has said, those matters of discretion, which as he's noted applies across the plan. What came through for me in the evidence was that there clearly is some areas of confusion and areas, particularly with the noise chapter, referring to, or how technical experts are referred to. I guess the generally accepted term is suitably qualified and experienced practitioner. So I think that's something we need to look at and think about, and how that's applied, ensuring consistency and improving readability in that regard. Other key matters, as I mentioned in my introduction, the Methanex, Motunui and Pohukura noise control boundary areas. And obviously with the site and notional boundary issue, I think that is a very key one for the rural production zone, and also where we're setting the noise limits for the rural production zone. Hamish may also have some other aspects he might want to add here.
Before we go, yeah, Hamish, if you can just come in with any other advice just on that general question.
The main one from my perspective would be the difference in the rural zone with site versus notional boundary, and reading the planning and noise evidence for particularly petroleum parties. What are the constraints in terms of complying with the site boundary, if that was what the proposed plan included?
So I missed what would be the, sorry, that last sentence?
Just the constraints on operations and complying with at the site boundary.
Okay, so the actual nuts and bolts of physical constraints in terms of operation.
Yes.
Right. That's helpful. The other question I have of a general sense is, you may note that tomorrow at the end of the day, we do have a slot set aside for potential hot tubbing of noise experts. I think we do have at least 3 or 4 very experienced experts, and with the subject like noise, I have in the past found it very useful to hot tub on issues that are common across the noise experts just to get views on a range of questions. Do you think in this case that that is going to be useful from your reading of the material or not? Is there enough common matters between the experts that would be productive or not is really what I'm asking.
I think yes. Yes, I think it could be useful to get them together to see if there are ways we can find some common ground. I think there are some fairly polarizing views though. So it may still come to needing the commissioners to come to some conclusions, but it could be worthwhile.
Okay, well, we'll monitor that as we hear the evidence, but just for the parties, we'll make a decision sometime tomorrow about whether we do use that slot which we've set aside. There may be some subsets that we do want to talk to one or two or more of the noise experts together, but that was helpful. Commissioner Littlejohn, do you have any other introductory questions?
Not of an introductory nature, no.
Okay, thank you, Holly, for that introduction.
Thank you.
I believe it's me next. So as before, kia ora koutou. My name is Erica Jane. I'm a consultant planner for the New Plymouth District Council. With my colleague Hamish Wesney, we've considered the submissions on and written the Section 42A report for the Light chapter. For the Light chapter, there were 10 original submissions and 3 further submissions received. In our analysis in the Section 42A report, we've grouped the submissions on the Light chapter into 3 key issues, which were managing the environmental effects of artificial light, strengthening the provisions, i.e. providing greater flexibility or clarifying the intent and scope of specific provisions, and consequential amendments. Having read the pre-circulated evidence in response to the Section 42A report, the remaining key issues of contention are the extent of the exemption for Port Taranaki and New Plymouth Airport from the Light R1 and Light S1 rule and standard, and which is supported by policies Light P1 and P2. And the second point of contention is managing the effects of artificial light on Indigenous fauna. There's one minor error we'd like to correct in the Section 42A report. So the table under Section 521, overview of officer recommendations, under amend Light S1, it states on the second point to refer to the statutory requirement to engage with the tangata whenua as cultural experts when assessing the effects of artificial light on cultural values. This should instead say refer to the Convention on Migratory Species, Light Pollution Guidelines for Wildlife, including marine turtles, seabirds, and migratory shorebirds for guidance on best practice when considering the effects of lighting on the natural behaviour of Indigenous fauna.
Can you just point us again to when we're making a correction to a provision, we just need to record that as we go along. So we've got a, can you just take us through the page number and the item again, just a bit more slowly?
Sure, so that is Section 521.
In Appendix 2?
That is in the main body of the Section 42A report.
All right.
So that is on page 10.
All right. So just tell us what you'd like us to cross out and to put in.
Okay, so in the table, it says amend Light S1. So
yes.
if we strike out that second bullet point, that should instead refer to the Convention on Migratory Species Light Pollution Guidelines, which we will get into more detail. I can read out the full title if you would like, it's quite long.
Okay. All right, I think I've got the gist of that. Thank you.
No worries. Yeah, if there's any other points of clarification, I'd also be happy to answer those now.
No, I think you have highlighted, after looking at the submissions, the two main matters, which is what we've read through from your report. So I don't have any specific questions at this stage. Commissioner Littlejohn?
Yeah, just a question of clarification from me. Thank you for the report. Did council seek any expert lighting engineering advice when looking through these provisions for its plan?
To my understanding, no.
Okay, so what you've done is essentially roll over the operative district plan rule and then have a look at a whole lot of other plans to see whether anyone sort of departed drastically from that and sort of stuck to the old way.
Effectively, yes.
Yeah, okay. All right, no, that's all I wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, you're good there, Nicola.
Yeah. Good morning. My name is Nicola Lawrenson. I'm consultant planner working in the district plan team at New Plymouth District Council. I've considered the submissions on and written the section 42A report for the earthworks chapter. It's important to note that that report also covers definitions to provide context to the earthworks chapter. And just while noting the definitions, I'd just like to outline and correct an error to the 42A report relating to definitions. I've got it here and I can't pass it to you, but I'm sure Julie's going to send it to you shortly. So in appendices 2 and 3, the definitions for gas transmission network and gas transmission pipeline corridor have been unintentionally omitted. These definitions were requested through submissions to support the inclusion of a new rule for earthworks in the vicinity of a pipeline administered by First Gas. The appendices have been amended to include these definitions, noting that the consideration of the definitions should be undertaken with the consideration of the new rules that are also sought by First Gas. So in the section 42A report, I've recommended that these submissions all be heard together in the hearing for network utilities. And the reason for that is because the PDP already contains a rule with a similar intent to that sought by First Gas in the network utilities chapter, and that rule is NU R39, earthworks within the gas transmission pipeline corridor. So in addition to that, I found an error over the weekend, which Julie doesn't know about yet. And this relates to an additional provision sought by Horticulture New Zealand for the removal or burial of unwanted organisms. In paragraph 116 of the 42A report, I considered that there to be sufficient coverage for that matter under the catch-all rule for earthworks, R12, but I incorrectly referenced the rule for silage pits and wrote down EWR11. It's also noted in the statement from Horticulture New Zealand that has happened. So I just want to apologise for that.
Don't apologise, Nicola. It's all happens all the time, and the main thing to note is that we just need those corrections recorded. And I think for all of the 42A reporters, if you can provide your opening statements and these written corrections to us, that would certainly be the way to do it. We'd normally have those given to us on the day, but if you can do that, each of you can do that, that'll be great. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'll do that after this. And I just want to go into the chapter itself now. So there we had 28 original submissions on the earthworks chapter. We had 17 further submissions. The submissions addressed all the objectives, policies, rules and standards. In my analysis of the submissions in the 42A report, I grouped the submissions on the chapter into 4 issues, which were tangata whenua, activities that involve earthworks, the effects of earthworks, and consequential changes. Having now read all the pre-circulated evidence in response to the 42A report, I consider there to be more than 2, unfortunately, several areas of contention on this chapter, and these are as follows. So for the one, our sole objective, we still have one submitter who has requested the term mitigation be defined so that it has the same meaning for all process participants. So with the policies, we've still got outstanding submissions on P1, which is an enabling earthworks policy subject to effects. We've got 2 submitters there. Earthworks policy 3, we've got 4 submitters on, and that's on the suitability of the policy generally, and some requests for amendments. We've got earthworks policy 4, which seeks to avoid adverse effects on archaeological sites and sites of significance to Maori. We've got 6 submitters still there to talk about that policy, and they relate to the suitability of the policy, duplication of sites of significance to Maori and historic heritage chapter provisions. And we've got earthworks policy 7, which seeks to ensure earthworks reflect natural landforms. We've got 1 submitter. Moving on to the rules. Earthworks rule 7, earthworks for the upgrade or maintenance and repair of the transport network. We've got 1 submitter. The recommended rule parameters are currently shared with EW rule 9. We've got EWR9, earthworks for network utilities, including vehicle access tracks for network utilities. We've got 3 submitters still there. There's some crossover in there with earthwork standards that we'll need to tease out. Earthworks rule R12, earthworks not otherwise provided for in this table. So this is the catch-all rule. We've got 2 submitters there. So they see increased volume allowed in the rural major facility zones and potentially retaining a volume based on the size of the property. We've got earthwork standards S2, still outstanding, maximum cut depth and fill height, 6 submitters there. Earthworks S3, site reinstatement, 1 submitter. Earthworks S4, control of silt and sediment, 1 submitter. Earthworks S5, accidental discovery protocol, we've got 2 submitters there. Definitions, so the definitions for cultivation and ancillary earthworks. We've got, and 2 other matters. So we've got 1, the inclusion of biosecurity response measures in a permitted activity rule, and the issue of natural landform. Any questions on any of those?
Not at this stage from me.
Great. And that's all from me for now. So sorry, I understand you want us to talk to the issue of restricted discretionary criteria. Can you just repeat that a little bit, what you're after? Or are you happy that we talk about that further on?
Yeah, I think we're happy for you to have a think about that and talk about that in your right of reply, your verbal right of reply and your written right of reply.
Okay, all right. I do have just a couple of comments about the submissions on that, if you want to hear that now. So we did have submissions on assessment, matters of discretion for historic heritage and sites and areas of significance to Maori. And the other matter that we had that was raised in the earthworks chapter was the reference and use of policies. So in the matters of discretion, actually stating the policy number. So that's across the plan. I understand it's not just for the earthworks chapter. And other than that, the matters of discretion didn't receive coverage in this chapter, other than those 2 items.
You mean coverage in terms of wanting a change in structure or clarity?
Yes.
Yeah. All right, thank you. Commissioner Littlejohn, anything else from you?
I was just going to pick up on the point, Nicola's last point. The cross-reference to policies is a feature of other plans I've seen, albeit within the assessment criteria. So you'll have assessment criteria for a particular RD activity, and it'll have, you know, the extent to which traffic safety will be impugned, the extent to which safe sight distances is acceptable, and then it will have the matters and policies X, Y, and Z. So it's really just a shorthand to make the policies part of the assessment criteria for restricted discretionary activities. So, and as I say, I think you've endeavoured to use that in some of these instances, but the issue still remains as to whether those are best expressed as assessment criteria or matters of discretion. I think that's the point I'm sort of fixated on at the moment.
Thank you. So we'll hear back from you, Nicola, on your thoughts on that in your your verbal and your written reply. Thank you.
Sorry, could I just ask another question of Nicola? Nicola, did you are you the same reporting officer on the other chapters where there are specific earthworks provisions that relate to district-wide matters like network utilities, sites and areas of significance to tangata whenua? Are you across all of the earthworks rules, or are there other authors that deal with those in the context of specific chapters?
So there are other authors for those chapters.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right. Have the various authors about the rules conferred on the scope and or overlap of particular provisions? Are you familiar with the prospect of duplication of rules?
Yes, absolutely. So I've had lots of conversations with the author for the sites of significance and historic heritage chapters, and we'll need to start those conversations for network utilities.
Okay, all right, no, that's good. Just to make sure that everyone's aware of the issue.
Thank you. Anything else, Kit? Oh, okay.
Good morning once again, Commissioners. I'm Ali Gibson, and I've prepared the somewhat lengthy Section 42A report for signs. The signs chapter includes 14 types of signs and manages these using the zoning tool and setting permitted standards, such as the maximum size of a sign, the maximum height of a sign, and the maximum number of signs on a site. Now, the provisions for signs are really rather permissive insofar as each sign type is permitted in certain locations subject to standards. And the chapter is enabling in that it makes extensive use of the restricted discretionary activity status. And I take your point, Commissioner Littlejohn, that the matters of discretion are therefore greatly important in decision making. So 193 original submission points and 81 further submission points were received on the signs chapter. And these came predominantly from the local business community. We had a number of companion submissions from the New Plymouth CBD and Waiwakaio business and landowners. So the submissions focused on 3 primary matters, and these formed the key issues in my analysis. Number 1, provide greater flexibility for third-party signs to be established in the district. Number 2, provide greater flexibility for digital signage to be established in the district. And the third one, to reduce the stringency across the chapter to allow for more signage and greater sign metrics. And that's specifically for 5 of the 14 sign types. Now, I'd like to acknowledge the careful consideration and analysis undertaken by the submitters, and I see there are several with us today. My recommended amendments have clarified the provisions, they've tightened the chapter, and what we've ended up with is establishing a preference for signs on buildings rather than freestanding signs, and also providing overall for a greater scale of signage, but not a greater number of signs. So specifically, I've recommended the following amendments in response to the submissions: permitting third-party signs in the town centre zone as well as the city centre zone, and relaxing the activity status for third-party signs and digital signs in many of the zones, increasing the permitted sign face area for many sign types, and lastly, increasing the amount of permitted under veranda signage. So now the evidence. Having read the pre-circulated evidence, I consider there to be 6 matters that remain in contention. They are quite discrete. Number 1, the policy requirement regarding cultural values. Number 2, the permitted minimum separation distances between signs. Number 3, signage provisions for the requested sub-regional centre zone. And number 4, the permitted maximum height for freestanding signs, and it's specific to several zones. 5, the permitted sign face area for signs on buildings. And lastly, digital signage on glazing and use of the term architectural features. Now, I'm aware that there will be lay evidence presented to you, and that's likely to add to the list of matters of contention. I don't have any corrections to offer you or to report. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. That's nice and clear. I don't have any follow-up questions. Commissioner Littlejohn? Okay.
I'll say it in person. No, that was a very thorough report. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kia ora. I believe I'm next.
Yes, it looks like it. You're lucky
Yes,
last.
lucky last. Well, as I said before, my name is Dermot Fringley, and I'm a policy advisor in the district plan team for the New Plymouth District Council. And I considered the submissions on and wrote the Section 42A report for the temporary activities chapter. Before I carry on, I wish to correct 2 errors to the temporary activities Section 42A report. Paragraph 39, the words strengthen and clarify wording in the chapter should read, provide greater flexibility, improve readability, and clarify the intent of specific provisions. Just as that was one of the key issues, just so that's all the same wording used throughout. And the second one is in section 5.1, paragraph 37, KiwiRail were not included in the list of submitters. Their submission was not omitted from consideration. It was just not included in that list. So I would like to add KiwiRail submitted in opposition of another submission requesting the removal of building setbacks for temporary activities. But that's all. So it wasn't a heavily submitted on chapter, but there were 20 original submission points and 13 further submission points were received from 7 submitters. The submitters were from Te Koutahitanga o Te Atiawa Trust, Ngāti Te Whiti, Kāinga Ora, KiwiRail, Port Taranaki Limited, the New Zealand Defence Force, and Fire and Emergency New Zealand. Over my analysis of all these submissions for the Section 42 report, I grouped them into 3 key issues. which were provide greater flexibility, improve readability, and clarify the intent of specific provisions. Issue 2 dealt with temporary military training activities and temporary emergency management activities, and then consequential amendments as issue 3. Having considered and read the pre-circulated evidence in response to the section 42A report, I consider that there is only one area of contention on this chapter, and that being in relation to rule Temp R2, which relates to temporary military training activities. As notified, Rule Temp R2 manages temporary military training activities as permitted activity subject to compliance with 4 noise, light and signs rules. The New Zealand Defence Force requests that Temp R2 is amended so that compliance is restricted just to noise R7 and noise R9. Oh no, I believe just noise R7, yes. But other than that, it's that's the only matter of contention that that I've identified based on the pre-circulated evidence. Is there any other matters that I could clarify further for you?
Just on that one, your appendix 1, Temp R2 and Temp R3 are effectively the same. I mean, they're both permitted subject to the matter there, is that right?
Yes, permitted subject to the when the activity complies with the following general district-wide rules. However, it is worth noting that not all of the noise rules apply to, some of them, they only apply to temporary military training activities, not to temporary emergency management training activities.
Gotcha. So if we were to accept the defence relief, you would end up with something else coming in under R2 because it will be a different standard that would apply just to the temporary military training activities.
Yes, yes.
Okay, just R7. Just R7, did you say?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, okay, cool. All right. No, thanks for clarifying that.
And I have no further questions, just an introduction. Thank you for that introduction, Dermot.
Cheers, thank you.
Right, I think we're about to move to our first submitter, who is the Department of Conservation. It's a good time to have a pit stop, I think, at 10:26. So let's just go and have a break and freshen up, and we'll see those that want to stay on back at 10:45 a.m. Thank you very much. Welcome back, people. I hope you've had a good break. Getting back into a new way of doing things. We still need to have a cup of tea and get ourselves organised. So that's great. So we are now moving to Department of Conservation. If just like to introduce the team, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, kia ora, Susan Newell. I'm the solicitor for the Department of Conservation, and appearing with me are Graham Taylor, who's an expert on seabirds, and Stephanie McNichol, who's the department's planning expert witness. So written legal submissions were filed on Friday. Hopefully those have been received, and rather than reading through them word by word, I propose to just talk to them if that's acceptable to the commissioners.
Yes, certainly, but just on a no rush basis. Just
okay.
Take your time. Let us know the key points. We have read them, but we are interested in your opinion on where things sit from a legal perspective. So
okay,
thank you for that.
All right. So the department's case in this part of the hearing is focused entirely on the effects of lighting on seabirds, and that's driven in part by the presence of seabird colonies in the islands off the coast of Taranaki and Namotu, and also the future prospect of two species in particular being likely to recolonise the Kaitaki Ranges as Project Taranaki Maunga is showing signs of success, and Mr. Taylor is going to discuss that in more detail. The two species, black petrel and Cook's petrel, were formerly present in the district, but were extirpated by predators which are now being eliminated. So it seems like an exciting prospect that they might be able to be reintroduced in the near future. And that possibility in my submission should be anticipated and provided for in the district plan. The current plan being reviewed is a good opportunity to incorporate some provisions that will be future-proof and will accommodate the maintenance of the habitat for the current species as well as species that are likely to be here in the near future. Ms. McNichol's evidence discusses the council's report, and generally the proposed provisions are supported. So we're not a long way apart from where the council officers are on these provisions. Just go through the relevant legal tests. So primarily Section 6 of the RMA states the matters of national importance that decision makers are required to recognise and provide for in relation to managing the use and protection of natural and physical resources. And in relation to these effects on artificial light that are the current concern, the relevant matters include Section 6A, which is to preserve the natural character of the coastal environment, wetlands, lakes and rivers, and to protect those areas from inappropriate use and development. And under Section 6C, to protect significant habitats of Indigenous fauna. So reference to Section 6C raises the question about what is significant habitat, and that needs to be determined in relation to the natural resources in the district rather than the region, or more broadly on a national scale that need to be protected. So an area that is in the district that qualifies as significant for the purposes of Section 6C can do so despite being modified, so there's no requirement for the habitat to be pristine. And the identification of significant ecological habitat qualifying for protection under Section 6C requires a factual assessment based on inherent qualities. The criteria which can assist in making that assessment have been well traversed in the case law. They include representative, which concerns the extent of range of genetic and ecological diversity, diversity and pattern of ecosystem and species, rarity or special features, naturalness, the size and shape affecting the long-term viability of species, communities and ecosystems, and the amount of diversity, inherent ecological viability, the relationship between natural areas and others of more modified character, and vulnerability to threats likely to cause disturbance and management input required to maintain or enhance an area's significance, including the degree of restoration potential.
Will, can you just, sorry to interrupt, can you just remind us of the context of that Western Bay case?
Yes, that
was it a plan case, or was it
the Minister of Conservation in Western Bay of Plenty? It was a decision of Judge Bollard. And I do note that I think that was aimed more, the criteria have been applied more to plants rather than habitat of fauna. So they're a little more difficult to apply in this case.
But was that a plan case, or I'm not?
Yes, it was the Minister of, actually, I have to confess, I'm not sure. Thank you.
I can help there. I think I was counsel at that. It's one of my earliest cases. It was a plan change case looking at putting in fencing standards for deer farming adjacent to Indigenous vegetation, and it really started the case law on determining the significance of terrestrial Indigenous vegetation. So that's what it very much was about. The issue of significant habitat, though, extends beyond Indigenous vegetation. There have been a number of cases recently, particularly concerning animals like bats and insects, where they have inhabited exotic locations, but because they are so rare, that habitat per se, even though it's been exotic vegetation, has been treated as significant for the purposes of habitat management. So it's broader than just Indigenous habitat. It's significant habitat regardless of the Indigenous nature of it. That's how I understand it.
Thank you. You've expressed that better than I could, I'm sure. It is good to hear it from the first-hand experience as well. And yes, I agree, the bat cases, there's been a few of them, and they've dealt with bat roosts in exotic trees, and also habitat of bats near areas that are being developed for urban housing development where lighting effects would be an issue. So including light from things like vehicles travelling through the area. The Amberfield cases on the outskirts of Hamilton is a recent one.
Just while we're discussing the sort of the scope of the submission, really, just out of interest, Ms. Newell, I've heard quite a lot in other plan hearings about potential noise effects on terrestrial Indigenous fauna. And Christchurch, for example, was a case where there was lots of evidence around birds and effects of noise. So just out of interest, the provisions in the plan around noise, you obviously haven't made submissions on.
No, and I think perhaps Mr. Taylor might be able to help you more, but
I'll wait for Mr. Taylor. But
yeah,
yes,
I'm aware that there's also been an interest about the effects of noise as we've had the lockdowns, and people have been noticing that birds are seeming to be able to communicate better and not have to sing so loudly. Mr. Taylor would have to advise you about whether that applies to the species in Taranaki.
We can't really explore it because there's no submissions. But,
No, true.
My real question for you, which is a follow-on, is other plan examples where light has been dealt with in the way you're proposing?
I can't direct you to any off the top of my head. Ms. McNichol may be able to help with that.
Come back to that stage.
Yeah, not that I know.
Yes,
Thanks.
so carry on, and sorry for interrupting.
Okay, that's all right. So I'll go back to paragraph 14 is roughly where I was up to. So discussing the potential for reintroduction of black petrels and Cook's petrels to the Kaitaki range, as I understand, is the most likely spot. If those reintroductions are successful, then the significance criteria for their habitat would apply to them, and that habitat, as well as the habitat between the ranges and the coast. And Mr. Taylor will discuss in his evidence the parts of the New Plymouth district that are the most important habitat for the species.
Look, I do have a question from both Mr. Taylor and Ms. McNichol about the sort of future potential habitat question, but from a legal point of view, what do you say about the ability of planners to deal with these sort of future type effects?
Yeah, I did consider that, and it's a difficult question, because if you're considering the factual basis for including provisions in the plan, then you really have to consider just that, the facts, which is what we've got before us now, and the future is a bit speculative. But in my submission, I mean, setting aside any legal issues, it would be sensible to anticipate that it seems very likely that these species are going to be there in the near future. And if that happens, then it's also very likely that the absence of any provisions could result in unfortunate consequences, like the sorts of fallouts of seabirds that Mr. Taylor has described. So generally speaking, I think it would be reasonable to take a precautionary approach towards the future state of the environment, as it seems very likely to be. And in the not too distant future, by all accounts, given I understand kiwi were recently reintroduced to the ranges. So it seems like that project is having good success.
I think, I haven't got in front of me, that the definition of effects does deal with future issues as well, but someone can probably look that up easier than I can.
I'll see if I can do that very quickly. I think you're right. No, I might have to come back to that.
Yeah.
Well, yes, actually, in the very next paragraph, the function of the council in section 31(1)(b)(3) of the RMA is to control any actual or potential effects of use. And I think that section referring to potential effects does allude to future effects as well. So notwithstanding the definition of effects, I think there's an obligation on the council to anticipate potential effects under that section. Control of the potential effects of light on populations of birds that is anticipated to re-establish in the district is also within the council's function to control. Section 7D of the council's functions must be exercised having particular regard to the intrinsic values of ecosystems, and intrinsic values is another term that's defined in the Act, and it means those aspects of ecosystems and their constituent parts which have value in their own right, including their biological diversity and the essential characteristics that determine an ecosystem's integrity, form, functioning, and resilience. The presence of Indigenous seabird species contributes to biological diversity, which is another defined term meaning the variability among living organisms and the ecological complexes of which they are a part, including diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. And natural darkness, or at the very least an absence of unduly intrusive artificial light, is an essential characteristic of ecosystems that include seabird species. For birds that are disoriented by artificial light and absence of light pollution helps ensure the integrity, functioning, and resilience of their ecosystems. Mr. Taylor's evidence is that artificial light can have catastrophic effects on petrels, especially fledglings. It is therefore reasonable for the council to manage artificial light as a potential adverse effect when having regard to the intrinsic values of ecosystems, and incorporating plan provisions to maintain natural darkness, or as near as can be achieved, would be consistent with the requirement to have regard to essential ecosystem characteristics for birds that can't function in artificial light. The presence, the presence of significant colonies of seabirds in the coastal environment and the likely prospect of petrel species recolonising the Maunga in particular has been the motivation for the submission on this part of the plan. And as I've said, seeking a set of plan provisions that are future-proof. And the hope is that ensuring appropriate provisions are in place now will reduce the need for future plan changes and for submissions to be made on development proposals that might otherwise fail to adequately address light effects. So that would make the planning process more efficient. Given the early indications that the Taranaki Maunga project is looking likely to be successful, this is an appropriate time to consider how the district plan can best manage any new lighting that may be installed, whether as part of a new development or when existing lighting is replaced. And my submission is that it's preferable to seek to manage light effects by including provisions in the plan now, which may help avoid the types of fallout events that Mr. Taylor has described. So if you have any further questions, I'm happy to look at answering them now. Otherwise, I will hand over to Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, Susan. I'll just see whether Commissioner Littlejohn has any questions.
Yeah, I do. I just want to test you a little bit on your legal argument here. And this should not be taken in any way as me personally not being enthusiastic at the prospect of the recolonising of the Kaitaki with taiko. I think it's a fantastic project, notwithstanding the questioning here. And I guess I'm just struggling with the notion of Section 31 being the tool to manage activities now in relation to potential future activities. This is what you've said. It's about the control or to control any actual or potential effects of the use, development, or protection of land for the purpose of maintenance of Indigenous biological diversity. And I guess the way I read potential in that phrase is it's the potential effects of the use, not the potential changes in the future environment that might come about by third parties reintroducing new species. And I guess where I see it, it's sort of becomes quite difficult is when you get to your section 32 analysis. And this is something that I'll sort of test Ms. McNichol on, because if you do a cost benefit analysis of putting in these provisions, then the cost of putting them in now is that you potentially impact upon activities that may wish or need to produce more light. But without the species that you are focusing on for management purposes actually being present, you can't really identify any benefit. And so this is a provision that simply has a cost with no real benefit in a tangible sense right now. It may have a benefit in the future, but that relies on something else happening in the interim. So I just want to test you a little bit on that. What's the legal basis, the section 32 basis for these sorts of provisions when you don't have the species present?
I accept what you're saying there. In terms of the costs that would be imposed, it's interesting to look at the standards that Mr. Taylor has referred to attached in his evidence and that we're proposing to be included. And they give examples of a couple of quite significant industrial developments where essentially I think what the standards are saying is that you can have the lighting that those developments need and avoid the adverse effects on them. So
but that doesn't answer the question.
Well, I'm getting to that point because I think if the standards are applied, even anticipating the future potential effect on seabirds that may or may not be there, there's not necessarily an extra cost to the developers that are applying one type of light or another. It's just a matter of making a choice that is informed by the provisions in the plan. And it may actually have a benefit in avoiding future costs of having to remedy the adverse effects of systems that were installed without that guidance or information at the very least. So I accept what you're saying, that if we apply the strict legal test and just look exactly at the situation now, then to include these provisions would direct developers to do lighting in one way rather than another way.
But I think what you've just said, which I've taken a note of, is that this is depending on the setting of your standard and what it actually requires, you've potentially got a provision that's all benefit and minimal cost. So why wouldn't you just not put it in?
Yes, thank you. That is a very concise way to say it. That is what I was trying to express.
Okay. Okay, that was all I really wanted to test you on there. And I do have some questions of Ms. McNichol when we get to her evidence.
Okay, so I'll hand over to Mr. Taylor now. Thank you.
Perhaps before Mr. Taylor starts, I'd like to signal a couple of matters that are weighing on my mind after reading both Mr. Taylor and Ms. McNichol's evidence and the suggested provisions. Firstly, this 20-kilometre suggested boundary, just wondered whether either of you have done a sort of a mapping exercise just to show where that might extend to. Certainly the close by islands seem to be pretty close to a number of established areas. So just from a factual perspective. And the second thing with some of the wording used relating to I think fauna, biodiversity associated with Indigenous fauna, that is a very broad term, includes lots of fauna that will be pretty much all over the district from time to time, thinking about kahu and other birds, for example, that are, seen throughout the district in New Zealand. So just those two thoughts in mind, particularly Ms. McNichol, you might just ponder those and get prepared to answer some questions about those matters. So yes, over to you, Mr. Taylor.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for the opportunity to present some information about the current seabird populations in the Taranaki area and also the future planning that we have for the area under the Taranaki Moanga project. So just to introduce myself, I'm Graham Taylor. I'm a Principal Science Advisor for the Department of Conservation in Wellington. I've been working on seabirds for the past 42 years, and my role has included work on critically endangered species, both in New Zealand and the Chathams, as well as overseas. I led some of the programs to reintroduce seabirds back to sites from which they'd been extirpated in the past. So the methodology that we would be looking at using on Mount Taranaki or the Kaitaki Ranges in the future would be using the techniques that I was involved with developing. So I guess one of the key issues with my current role is that I am the National Science Counsellor for CMS, the Convention on Migratory Species, and I'm also the Oceania rep on that committee. So that the endangered species and threatened species that I work with are very relevant to the convention. Just as a brief overview, New Zealand has about a quarter of the world's breeding species of seabirds. We've got more endemic species of seabirds than all other countries combined, and we've got more threatened species of seabirds. So New Zealand is a world centre for seabird biology and breeding, and it's critically important that we get it right here. With the Taranaki region, it's not super rich in seabirds compared to areas like the Hauraki Gulf or the Subantarctics. It does have 15 breeding species. Most significant colonies are actually very close to New Plymouth on the Ngāmotu Sugarloaf Islands. We've got a very important colony there of flesh-footed shearwaters that's expanding rapidly. One of the very few colonies in the country that is expanding. And we've also got the largest diving petrel colony on the west coast of the North Island. There's also the southern limit for grey-faced petrel and other endemic species. And with climate change, we're expecting that species to keep creeping further southwards as more species move in a polar direction as the oceans warm up. So there are actually existing values that are pretty important. All of those species are susceptible to light attraction. So even without the future planning options that we're talking about for the Taranaki Mountains, we do have existing species that are very vulnerable to light. So I'll just talk briefly about what we're thinking about for the Taranaki Mountains. There are two species that we consider would have been breeding there in the past. We know for sure that black petrel or taiko was nesting there as late as the 1950s. Photographic evidence of a chick photographed up on the Kaitaki Ranges. All those species, of course, are vulnerable to predators, stoats, rats, possums, those sort of things. And so the work that's going on the mountains at the moment to remove those pests is pretty important as a lead up to our ability to restore the species back up onto the mountain. And currently the black petrel is confined.
Could I just interrupt you? I think we will be hearing quite a lot of evidence about the Moanga project, its extent and where things are up to with that, but it would certainly help me if you could just give a couple of minutes synopsis about that project, what its status, Department of Conservation's involvement, other parties' involvement, and how long the program is, money committed, those sorts of things. So if you're familiar with those aspects, that would provide
It's a community and Department of Conservation partnership project with external funders who are looking at trying to restore the biological values of the mountains. One of the key aspects of that is to remove the pest species that are up there. So, the possum, stoats and rats have to be removed. Make sure that there aren't large ungulates grazing out the landscape. And so there's a lot of money being invested in trying to make that site suitable for a wide range of species and for introductions, of which already things like kiwi and others have been started to be put back onto the mountain. The seabirds have particular requirements that they are very vulnerable to even very low densities of pests. So there are to be two options. One would be to use initially a pen concept, a fenced off area that the birds would be put into to give them the protection to get started. And as the success of the pest control runs out over time, there would be an opportunity to expand those birds into other parts of the ranges. But I think for the initial period, we would be looking at using a predator fenced area as an introduction site onto the mountains. And so the two species that are most suited for this would be the black petrel and Cook's petrel, partly because they have a history of being in the mountain ranges in the Taranaki area from historical records, and they are known to survive in those habitats in terms of their ability to climb trees to get out to sea. The current species that are in Taranaki are basically coastal species that don't go inland, like the flesh-footed shearwater and diving petrel. So we would have to bring in species from further afield. And there's already attempts to do this in Hawke's Bay at Boundary Stream area. They've been introducing Cook's petrels there and have had some success now with birds returning to that site. Black petrels haven't yet been shifted, but there have been successful attempts with other species that are close relatives. So we have reasonable expectations that they will work for the black petrels. One of the key advantages of getting black petrels back up onto the mountain is that there's a huge habitat in the Tasman Sea that's not really exploited by black petrels at the moment because of the prevailing winds. They can't get into that area. And so if we can get them established up on the mountain, then there's a big chunk of foraging habitat in the southern Tasman and central Tasman, which will be available for that species. They are also a species that's highly vulnerable to fisheries bycatch. They're the most at-risk species in New Zealand from fisheries bycatch. And a lot of that also is from recreational fishing, and the recreational fishing pressure is only intensifying in the Hauraki Gulf and Bay of Plenty areas. More and more people buy boats and go out fishing. The central Tasman is a zone where there would be low risk of recreational fishing impacts, obviously.
Yeah.
So it's from the department's perspective, we are interested in getting these species established.
Okay, just hold your thought there, because you do cover the habitat availability in the Tasman Sea in your evidence, but just following on from the Moonga project, I'm actually actively involved personally in the Cape Sanctuary project in Hawke's Bay, where there's a predator-proof fence and much denser seabird colony fencing and pens, where there's even higher level of predator control. Is that the type of thing you're thinking about? I don't know whether you're familiar with Cape Sanctuary.
Yes, I am. I am familiar with the Cape Sanctuary site. So yes, although they've got the larger predator fence, they have to establish the birds within a smaller predator fenced area, which has been successful at getting both grey-faced petrels and diving petrels established. And in fact, the diving petrels came from Ngā and were shifted across there. So so that is the concept that we'd be looking at doing initially, at least until such time as the tools that are being developed for predator-free 2050 have reached a point where we'd have high confidence that populations of pests on the mountain are kept at very low levels or are totally gone. So I think it would have to be a temporary fencing concept initially.
Okay, and I'll just after a clarification, you say that the taiko and I think the Cook's petrel, they climb trees to get out to sea. Can you just explain that? Is that fledglings climb up trees to launch themselves off, or how does that actually work from a behavioural perspective?
It means they can nest under a tall forest and climb up the trees. A lot of the other species aren't tree climbers, so they would have to walk a long distance to get to an open patch, a bluff or a cliff or something like that. So those species actually can nest directly below a tall tree and climb straight up it and get up into the canopy and get out, which is a huge ecological advantage for them, that they can nest inland, whereas the other species are coastal nesters primarily because they walk to a cliff top to take off. So I feel like those are the reasons why we'd be looking at using those species. Yeah.
And one last question on the way through, just the avoidance behaviour of these birds in terms of where they nest and live. Are they actively going to dark places, or for example on the Sugarloaf and Namotu Islands, are they nesting away from the light sources, or is that they're not being selective in that?
The species, I have been on both the islands, the major breeding colonies out there, and the ones out on Motomahanga are sort of on a flattish plateau on the top, and they can fly out to the open sea from the western side of the island. The ones on Motoroa are more inclined to be over on the western side of the island, away from the city lights. There has been past issues with fallout at the ports, particularly of juvenile common diving petrels when they first fledge. So that is a bit of a risk, being so close to sort of the lights of the city at the moment. But in general, yeah, these seabirds are nesting on, offshore islands that are remote, dark habitats where they breed. But as I've said in my evidence, the problem we've got now in Auckland region is that the Cook's petrels, which are coming off Little Barrier, vast numbers of them are being drawn into the city lights and crash landing around the city, particularly the fledglings when they first depart. And so there is a real change that's been happening. It basically started after they removed pests from the island. So there used to be Kiori rats on Little Barrier, which took out a very high proportion of the chicks each year. And after the removal of those rats, the chick productivity rate increased dramatically up to about 80%, which has caused a lot of chicks to fly towards Auckland as they depart. And we've also had black petrels coming off Great Barrier and potentially Little Barrier as well towards the cities, including one bird that was tracked with a satellite transmitter that did a huge circuit around Auckland City over Hamilton and eventually crash landed in a sports field in Paira, attracted them by very bright lights at Paira. So they are vulnerable to light attraction when they first depart. Adult birds become more adjusted to light sources and so get better at recognizing it and tend to be less vulnerable. But there is a high vulnerability around new moon periods on foggy nights when the birds get disorientated. And it's presumed that they lose their ability, their night vision is decreased and they can't fix on stars above them and stuff like that. So that is when crash landings are more likely to happen. And we're getting this situation happening with Hutton shearwaters coming out of the mountains behind Kaikoura, crash landing into the township and those sort of conditions. And increasingly in Auckland on foggy nights now we're getting crash landing events happening with both adults and fledglings. So there is a known risk of light attraction for these nocturnally active seabirds, but certainly exacerbated on nights with dark moons and foggy conditions. So the rest of the report, it mentions about the guidelines that were developed by the Australian government, and these were put up to the Convention of Migratory Species as an international standard, and were assessed by the Science Council of CMS, and it was agreed that these were the current best practice guidelines available on how to minimise the impacts of lighting on a whole range of migratory species. I mean, in New Zealand, we've primarily only got two main groups that migrate. We've got the seabirds that migrate up and down the country, and we've got some cuckoos, long-tailed and shining cuckoos that migrate at night. There's some movement also of shorebirds from the South Island braided rivers. So we've got, oyster catchers and pied stilts and dotterels and ribals coming up from the South Island, heading to the big harbours around Auckland during the winter, and then heading south again. And they are known from tracking studies to pass directly over top of Taranaki. So it's right under the flight path of those birds. Wherever they are as vulnerable to light attraction at night, I don't have as much expertise on that. I do know that the nocturnally active seabirds, because they've got outstanding night vision, same as an owl, they can see in pitch darkness, whereas we wouldn't be able to see a hand in front of our face. They're more than capable of doing all their activities at night in those very dark conditions. So that's the group that I obviously can say would be at risk from light attraction. And I think the guidelines as
hold it there. You sort of perhaps to slow down a little bit because we are interested in these points. I do have a question around your paragraph 44, which relates to both black petrels and Cook's petrels being migratory species.
Yes.
Where are they migrating to and from?
Okay, yeah. So the black petrel in the non-breeding season migrates across the Pacific Ocean to the west coast of South America and Central America. So it's basically considered a native species of Panama, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and also parts of Peru. So they have our birds visiting there during the winter here in New Zealand before they return back to New Zealand. The Cook's petrels migrate across to either the coast of Peru or up to the coast of California. And so they are migratory into those two areas. So they're definitely well-known migrants into those areas during their non-breeding season. During the breeding season, they can migrate as far across as the coast of Australia as well. So we've got black petrel sightings off Australia during the summer, and the Cook's petrels go into the high seas. And under the UN convention, the high seas is considered a zone for migration as well. It's not just to an EZ of another country, and the high seas is also considered a migratory movement, provided it's regular and cyclical, which it is for those species.
And do these birds,
in fact, about 50 of our species in New Zealand migrate into the high seas. So, yeah.
Yeah, do these birds come back to where they were born? Is that the theory?
That's the theory, yep. There's certainly evidence from the Black Petrel Project, which has been going since the mid-90s, that birds are breeding close to where they were born, but birds do disperse a little bit further afield. And so with the whole translocation proposal, you have to move the chicks far enough advanced of when they first start emerging from their burrows that they think that the place that you've transferred them through is their home, and then they return back to that site. And so we know from the Cook's petrels shifted down to Boundary Stream that, we've got birds returning back to burrows very close to where they were introduced. And we've had other projects elsewhere where we've had return rates as high as 80%, like with the Chatham Island taiko, for example. About 80% of the chicks have come back to the colony that they were shifted to rather than their natal site.
That boundary stream is very remote and be very dark, correct?
That's right. Yeah, it's about 25 kilometres inland from the coast.
Yes. So
up on a mountain range.
So quite different situation, perhaps not to Mount Taranaki, but certainly around the Sugarloaf Islands, where it's close to.
Yes, that's right.
Yes. So look, I know I do have one other question, just reading your evidence. What are the particular areas in Taranaki that you're most concerned about in terms of light sources?
Well, basically all light sources that are not well positioned have a risk to seabird attraction. We know from the black petrel work that bright lights, particularly sports fields, where they've got a huge glow coming out, are highly attractive to the birds. In an urban setting, it's obviously impossible to stop there being light. People need light for safety, they need light for industry. So we're not saying we don't want there to be lights in cities. What we're asking in our evidence is that the light is used only where it's necessary, that it's particularly the two valuable things that are needed are lights that are directed downwards rather than upwards. So lights shielded and facing down are known from all international work to have a lower impact on migratory species or other birds that are attracted to lights. And just unnecessary lighting in buildings where, if you can shield it through curtains or whatever, then turn it off or cover it. It just reduces the total quantity of light that's coming into the environment. And particularly remote places are vulnerable too. So for example, farms where they've got a bright light on a cow shed, for example, if that was directed downwards and shielded, that would actually be less of a risk for birds, say if they're coming off the mountains, than something that's shining up. It's just that the birds are coming in from above and they're looking down on the landscape. So the bright light glaring up at them is actually what attracts them down. rather than the overall volume of light per se. So that seems to be, that's where they crash land, is where there's bright upward directed lights rather than where the light is downward directed.
I suppose one consequential question, are they attracted to the lights glaring upwards because they're disorientated, or are they looking for something, or are they, what's the behavioural science about that?
Yeah, it's still poorly understood exactly what motivates them to come in. It's a bit like why do moths fly to house windows at night, that sort of thing. It's not really understood. There's theories around the fact that they're attracted to bioluminescent light sources. So the nocturnally active seabirds feed at night on prey species like myctophid fish, which have a bioluminescent glow on them, and they find their prey that way through the bioluminescent light. There's also theories around moonlight, that they might get mistaken for the rising moon or something like that, so they head towards it. It could just be disorientation due to their night vision is exceptional compared to humans. I mean, they're seeing way better than we do, and if you have your night vision disrupted, like if we go out of our houses at night, we're blind for a while until our eyes adjust to the dark conditions, and the birds might be the same situation, that they just get disorientated, they can't figure out really where they're going, and they just circle around the lights and eventually crash land as they lose speed. So there's a range of theories as to why lights draw birds down to the ground, but it's the science around it is still not well understood. Yeah. So anyway, so you can see from what I put into the submission that these internationally accepted guidelines that were passed at the last CMS COP in India in 2020, they were considered by members of the international community from the 130 signatories of the convention, and there was no one there who felt that they had any better guidelines internationally for how to manage the impacts of lighting. And so they were universally adopted as a resolution at the meeting. And so what we're asking councils to do is to consider these guidelines as a good standard to try and adopt to minimise the impact and disturbance of lighting in the landscape. We know that increasing urbanisation and coastal sprawl and stuff like that is pushing more and more light out into what areas used to be dark in the past. And if we can reduce the extent of light impact on a whole range of species that move around at night, then there has to be a benefit. And we know things like kiwis feed at night, and the extent of light on their landscape, it could well be having an effect on them. There's definitely differences between full moon nights and dark nights with kiwi behaviour in terms of call rates and stuff like that. So there's more than just the seabirds at risk here. I mean, it's a suite of natural biota that have a nocturnal behaviour that we'd be hoping that these guideline standards will improve the natural environment of the Taranaki area.
Thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to highlight? We've certainly read through your evidence, and it looks like you've had a pretty fascinating life.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's not too bad. No, I think those are it. I mean, I felt like, what's in there provides the guidance that we're hoping will get changed in the district plans from here on in, that people will start to take on board the fact that light is a pollutant just as much as, water quality issues and things like that have a lot of interest with the public, that I think people have probably underestimated how important it is to have dark skies. And there's an increasing movement around the world now to cherish the value of dark skies as a natural character of our planet. And so, yeah, we're just looking at some ways to improve it here in Taranaki.
Can you point to any plans you're aware of around New Zealand that are handling their noise provision, light provisions as you suggest?
There's a current one on at the moment in Westport with some plans to develop, I think it's iron sands or something in the Punakaiki area. So we do have some concerns around the impacts on the Westland Petrel Colony at Punakaiki with the amount of light from that mining proposal that's going there. And there's definitely stuff going on in the Hutton Shearwater, Kaikoura area around trying to reduce and minimise the amount of light within Kaikoura, because there's a lot of fallout issues, particularly with the chicks departing from the colony in March, April, where they land on the roads and get hit by traffic and end up in people's backyards and get killed by pets and things like that. So there is these standards being looked at around other parts of the country.
In the context of the district plan review?
Yeah, I think the one, I'm not sure if it's that with the West Coast one at the moment, or if that's might be specific to the actual industry plan that's going on there. But yeah, I'm sorry, I can't answer the question about what's happening with district plans. Maybe Susan, one of our other team, might be able to provide advice on that.
Thank you. So, Commissioner Littlejohn, I'll hand over to you.
You've actually answered a couple of the questions already in your discussion, Mr. Sydney, so I appreciate that. In paragraph 20 of your evidence, you talk about the petrel being particularly vulnerable to long line fishing methods, and certainly I'm familiar with that issue in the Hauraki Gulf. Are there similar threats that you're aware of in Taranaki?
Yeah, there has been captures of flesh-footed shearwaters in North Taranaki, which is actually what prompted our survey out on the Motumahanga Island a couple of years ago, to see what the size of the population there, which actually surprised us. The colony has grown substantially from what used to be only about 100 pairs up to about 550 pairs. So it's actually one of the very few colonies nationally that's increasing in its numbers.
What information can you give me though on the extent of long line fishing in in the waters off Taranaki?
There's definitely long line fishing happening. Yeah, you can look up, there's websites from Fisheries New Zealand and from Dragonfly, another agency in Wellington that has that information about the extent of fishing. Yep.
Okay, but you don't know it off the top of your head?
Not off the top of my head. I've seen maps showing quite a lot of extensive fishing in the sort of west coast of the North Island. Yep.
Thank you for clarifying how you create a new colony, and I think I've written it down. You translocate the chicks when they're young enough not to be able to distinguish where they were, which burrow they're coming out of, so that they effectively set their guidance systems to that point. So yes. that's quite helpful. I had the fortune many years ago to go to Aotea when the taiko were returning to their nests, and it was a middle of the night journey out with some dock officers sticking my hand into burrows, and I can absolutely attest to their ability to climb trees, having got a few of their barbs in my arm occasionally. They are very adept at getting up the trees. So, but again, the information we got there was that they will generally come back to a relatively small area from where they originally fledged from. So that's helpful. In paragraph 27, you talk about presence of bright light sources near any future site chosen for reintroduction of petrels. And I just want to get a bit more of a sense of what you consider to be near. Are we talking 5 kilometers? Are we talking 200 kilometers? What's the sort of area out setback from these? I mean, I've got a map open in front of me. If we're looking at the Kaitaki Ranges, we're probably how many kilometers to the water? Maybe 15 kilometers, if that, from the edge of the Kaitakis. So where would
maximum that?
Yeah, where would so where would you say near? Is this where the 20 kilometer setback that you're suggesting in the planning evidence comes from?
It's what you'd be looking for would be to try and locate the colony away from the brightest light sources, which would obviously be New Plymouth. So you'd be looking at trying to situate the colony more to the dark side of the mountain, which would be facing southward.
Southwest,
and obviously the birds will have a flight path that will bring them in from the coast directly to the colony. So if you've got birds flying in, you'd be trying to direct them over the most limited number of light sources that they would be coming through. And
do you know how sensitive?
key concern.
sorry, do you know how sensitive? I mean, if a bird sets off the kaitakis, is it likely to be distracted by the lights in the distance of New Plymouth City generally at night time? I mean, do you have any sort of information about the sensitivity of the lights?
Just that example I gave earlier of the tracked, Tycho petrol that came off Great Barrier that literally went over Auckland, Hamilton, and ended up landing in a sports field in Pyra. So they can get moved over long distances if the conditions are not right. I mean, if you hit, that was a particularly foggy night right over the top of the North Island, and so the birds got very disorientated. I feel like, and if they departed on a moonlit night, for example, there would be very limited impact. They would just go straight out to sea because the moon is the brightest light in the sky, effectively. Yeah.
Okay. All right. That's good. Okay. I think that was it. It's the only matter I wanted to clarify. Thank you, Mr. Taylor. It was very helpful.
Okay, no problems.
I do have two follow-up questions that I'd like to put to you, Mr. Taylor. The first one is, given your answers to Commissioner Littlejohn, it seems like there's an ability for the Maunga project and the Department of Conservation to target predator controlled seabird areas, well away or away from light sources. And if that's the case, that's a proactive, seems to be a proactive management technique that's available.
The thing is that these predators are very mobile. I mean, stoats have been tracked moving 10 kilometres in a night, for example. So you do have to extend your boundary of control over quite a big area to prevent them getting into the zone. I personally believe that you would have to fence off a small area of habitat initially. I don't think the current ability to remove and reduce pest numbers down to low enough levels is available at this point in time, but it is actively being researched by a whole range of groups at the moment. So within 10 to 20 years, we may be able to look at opportunities to do more transfers to other sites that would be currently too vulnerable to pests. But yeah, I think at the moment what you mentioned about the Cape Sanctuary site is the model that we'd be looking at doing.
So this wasn't really an answer to my question. My question was, it seems to be possible to locate a seabird enclosure like is at Cape Sanctuary and orientated away from light sources. So you do have a management technique for locating these areas quite apart from any district plan controls. Is that correct?
I think it would be a matter of prudence to put the colony in a place where it's not directly facing the brightest light source, which would be New Plymouth City, just because it's got the largest ambient light and the port. But once the birds go up and airborne, of course, they are potentially able to fly in any direction depending on which way the wind's going. But on an average night, they would probably fly directly between the colony and the coast. That would be the most normal path they would take. So if you can minimize the amount of light sources close to the new colony site and within the flight path that the birds would adopt, you would have a better chance of success rather than lots of fallout risk.
And do you think it would be possible to focus any controls around specific areas rather than having blanket district-wide controls as being suggested?
Obviously, if there's a new colony going in, you'd want to have minimal upward facing light close by. That would make more sense to do it that way. But I feel that what we've talked about earlier is that these birds can range over a large area, and it's not just the ones we're talking about introducing into the mountains. There's already seabirds of importance breeding at Ngamotu that would be vulnerable to light attraction as well, like the diving petrels. We know flesh-footed shearwater chicks have crash landed on cruise boats, for example, in the Hauraki Gulf and had mortality from that. So I feel like there's a need right across the district to try and improve the standards of how we manage lighting, not just in the focus zone up on the mountain where we might be looking at moving birds in the future.
Okay. And one last, it's a technical question. The size of these birds and the technology around transmitter systems that you can attach to them, are they big enough to handle that? And are transmitters regularly used for monitoring purposes on these species?
Yes, they have been tracked. Is now transmitters down to about 5 grams in size. There's one we're just starting to use that has its beams up to the International Space Station, for example, and is a German developed transmitter, which are very lightweight and are starting to get used on a wide range of species. So that technology is there, and it would be possible to do some tracking of chicks if you did your first translocation, for example, just to get an understanding of where they end up going on their first flight.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So thank you for your evidence, Mr. Taylor, and we're moving to you now, Mrs. McNichol.
Kia ora. I may start from point 17, which is the executive summary. I'll take the above parts as being read. They just talk about my experience, the code of conduct, and the scope of evidence. So if I start from point 17, where I state that I largely support the general direction and approach of the council to include light provisions within the plan, noting that the submission points made by the Director General have generally been accepted or accepted in part, and my evidence generally supports those changes. So the key points addressed in my evidence, there's 3. One is around a discussion in relation to the light provisions, including clarification referred to in the reporting officer's section 42A report around Indigenous biodiversity and Indigenous fauna. I also discuss the addition of exemption wording for the airport and port activities. I consider further clarity may be necessary to ensure the scope of operational activities are more specific and not open to an overly broad interpretation. I also refer to the section 42A report of the council, where they refer to the recommendations of the light pollution guidelines as assessment criteria rather than a permitted activity standard. So also copies of the additional changes in wording are attached in Appendix 2 of my evidence. So in terms of the areas of alignment with the council officers' reports, the inclusion of a lighting chapter and policy framework within the proposed plan is supported. I agree that excessive artificial light spill and glare can have adverse effects on the natural behaviour of sensitive Indigenous biodiversity, including further Indigenous biodiversity loss as a potential consequence. The parts of the section 32A reports that I agree with is inclusion of the light chapter and policy framework, which I understand in the previous plan was light and included under the amenity provisions. So I agree that these provisions are needed to manage the adverse effects of activities that generate excessive light spill or glare from artificial lighting on the local environment. And I support the avoidance of repetition of lighting provisions throughout each zone chapter of the proposed plan. So when I talk about, and I'm up to point 25, the consideration of the environment and which effects should be managed, I consider the adverse effects of artificial lighting on Indigenous biodiversity as a sensitive part of the local environment that has not been considered in the report. In my opinion, the RMA definition of environment would be inclusive of migratory wildlife species such as seabirds and migratory shorebirds. And the technical evidence provided by Mr. Graham Taylor confirms migratory seabirds are present and form a significant part of the local Taranaki environment. For this reason, I consider that making provision within the proposed plan to protect, restore and enhance the local Taranaki environment for migratory wildlife species is appropriate, subject to adopting the most appropriate approach for successfully achieving this outcome.
Ms. McNichol, can I just interrupt there? Have you read the procedures for these hearings?
Yes.
Okay, so we have read through all your evidence in detail. We had asked for a summary or synopsis to be read out at the start. So I think just from a process point of view, we don't need you to read through all of your evidence. It's more a question of highlighting the key points. And I'm thinking you haven't prepared a summary statement, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so I think, yeah, just for a matter of process, that's been our request. So I think as you go through, can you just perhaps focus on the key points and paraphrase, because we have read your evidence.
Yes.
Thank you.
So when I refer to the permitted activity standards under point 29, I'm recommending that it is appropriate to adopt the standards or the light guidelines as a permitted activity standard. And in my view, this would be consistent with the NZCPS, and it would provide suitable environmental conditions to support the successful return of seabirds to the habitat of Taranaki maunga. So the matters in the report that I don't agree with or that I sought changes to relate to the exceptions. I talk about recognising that the exclusions relate to shipping and aviation are necessary for navigation and health and safety, but I consider that the policies are left open and are too broad. So I have recommended some wording there that narrows the scope to health and safety and navigation matters and addresses excess light spill in a new standard. In relation to the seabirds, I've also proposed a new light standard, which is where I refer to the 20 kilometres of the identified features, which are Namotu, Poaka Ranges, Kaitaki Ranges, and the Taranaki maunga. And I believe that these ranges and identified locations have been supported in Mr. Graham Taylor's evidence. I believe that these provisions and amendments will ensure that lighting, which is not necessary for navigation or health and safety, will still allow lighting to be appropriately managed by the plan.
Ms. McNichol, you heard my question about whether you've actually mapped that 20 kilometre area. Have you done that?
No. I am able to do that if it pleases the Commissioner.
Yes, I think that would be helpful for us just to get a geographical area. I think I've done a few measurements myself on various maps, and it is certainly quite an extensive area that would be covered. So yes, if you could do that for us and provide that to us in the next day or two, that would be useful. Thank you. And the way to do that would be to provide a covering note and any mapping you do to our hearing administrator. Okay?
Yes. I then refer to my recommendation to include the light pollution guidelines as a permitted activity standard. I know that this is not recommended by the Section 42A report. However, I consider that there is already an existing provision alongside light R1, and that this creates the scope to be able to include it. And I also refer to the key messages in the light pollution guidelines outlined in the evidence of Mr. Taylor, which indicate that this could easily be incorporated into the standards. I just note further that the Section 42A report of the Council does include reference to the standards as, I believe, assessment criteria. So my recommendation is to move that across to be a permitted activity standard. I also clarify the terminology used where the submission referred to Indigenous biodiversity. The 42A report said that there was no reference to effects of lighting on Indigenous flora. So my recommendation in terms of appropriate terminology would be to use the term Indigenous fauna and their habitats. And I state that the inclusion of and their habitats is necessary, in my opinion, as the effects of lighting on the species is also about how the species interact with their habitats. And that has been covered by Mr. Taylor's evidence. I just refer to the higher order policies that I think can support the provision being included as a permitted activity standard. So I refer to the NZCPS, the provisions that talk about the potential adverse effects on Indigenous biodiversity, which I believe would be in conflict with the protection, preservation, restoration and rehabilitation of the natural direction of the policies, and therefore, in my view, must be considered. I also refer to the regional policy statement, which I believe has provisions that enable Indigenous biodiversity to be considered in terms of the wildlife species, wildlife values, species and habitats that would be in conflict with the protection, enhancement, maintenance and restoration provisions of the RPS. So to conclude, in my opinion, by incorporating the guidelines within the permitted activity standard will ensure that adverse effects of lighting on the natural behaviour of Indigenous species and their habitats can be managed appropriately and will be consistent with the NZCPS. So that concludes my evidence, subject to any questions the hearing panel have.
Thank you very much. You certainly did well, just paraphrasing as we went along once I made that clear, so I really appreciate how you did that. I will pass over to Commissioner Littlejohn first. I do have a couple of questions myself, but we'll start with Kit. Thank you. Need to unmute, Kit.
Unmute. There we go. I was going to say I've done a number of cases over the years trying to give policy 14 of the NZCPS a bit of a leg up, and I'm pleased that someone else has identified it and is using it to give something else a leg up now. So I'm quite happy with that. I know where you want to go with your changes, but I'll be upfront and say I think they've just got a few problems with them. And again, I don't want this to be seen as being in any way negatively aligned to the objective the Director General is trying to achieve. It's all about trying to make some provisions that are going to have a meaningful impact in the longer term. So just going through your appendix, and just some general observations here. And of course, we've got to hear back yet from council staff as to what they think your propositions are. So I'm not going to get into the objectives and the policies. I think the concepts we're trying to incorporate into them are not in dispute. I'm just conscious of the language becoming a little bit clunky so that it doesn't make sense. But those are things I'm going to reflect on. I want to come to the effects rule and the effects standard, because we've got an effects rule. There's only one rule for lighting, which is that all artificial light is permitted, provided it complies with the standard. Okay, so that's a fairly simple rule. We've then got things that the rule doesn't apply to, specifically excluded, and you've made some suggested changes there. And I guess the one I just wanted to sit down upon is your number 3, which is where you've attempted to deal with the breadth of what was suggested as 5 and 6, and focusing on the aspect of it which is you've identified as relevant, and you've categorized it as lighting necessary for health and safety. And I guess the question I want to put to you is, to operate as an exclusion, you really need to have something which is objectively verifiable and defensible. And so the problem I guess I've got with 3 is that it is potentially debatable about whether the lighting is necessary for health and safety on a case-by-case basis. And I guess it sort of provokes the question, who determines? And is it up to the person who's making the light to assert that their lighting is necessary for health and safety? And what if someone disagrees with that? How do you create an exception that comes down to what could end up being a difference of opinion between the person emitting the light and the person trying to have the light included within the rule itself?
Yes, I understand what is being sought there, and I agree it needs work. It is trying to essentially narrow the scope so that the lighting is not unnecessary. For example, I think in the Section 42A report, it may have also tried to go there as well by saying that in relation to the airport and the port, that car parking areas, for instance, would not require the type of standard that would be required for navigation of shipping or landing of aircraft.
Yep, okay. We then get to the standard, and as currently crafted, there are 2 standards. There's one that applies in effectively the busy zones: commercial, residential, general industrial, open space, airport, hospital, port, major facility zone. And then there's the second one, which applies in the rural, the multi-purpose, and the future urban. And you're proposing introducing a 3rd standard that would apply to all zones. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So the standard would apply, as I read it, regardless of the lux level that would potentially be emitted by the light source. Is that right?
I believe so.
So that if it was within this area you've identified, then in order to be permitted, it would have to comply with the proposed standard, regardless of how bright it is.
I think so, yes.
Okay, so that's a fairly broad obligation on any person wanting to install lights, isn't it?
I think it would come back to the mapping and the provision itself being specific to those locations. I myself would like to see what that mapping looks like and how much that would cover. I think it may be, as you've said before, that it is a bit clunky, but the intention, I think, is to have it considered for those locations and to have it as a rule, so that it's not lost.
The problem is it's not operating as I suppose it is a rule of sorts. It's a standard on the permitted activity rule, which applies regardless of the lux level being emitted and regardless of where it is, which, you know, as a theoretical proposition, I don't have an issue with. But I guess the next question that it provokes in my mind is, what is it that you want the lighting within that area to do or to achieve? Because reference to, you know, an obligation on a light emitter to simply consider a guideline is very difficult to enforce. It's very difficult to identify what is actually trying to be achieved. It doesn't really operate as a standard to refer someone to a guideline, and I guess that's what my problem is with it. Have you given any thought to what it is you would actually like lights to achieve within that area that's objectively verifiable, and not just deferring the emitter to a guideline that they should think about?
I would need to give that some more consideration, I think.
Yep. Okay. All right. Well, I can't really take that much further, Mr. Chair. I didn't have any other questions either. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. McNichol, are you aware of other district plans? You might have been prepping for this since I raised it at the start, where we're dealing with similar provisions or those being promoted by the department or anyone else?
There is a plan that deals specifically with artificial lighting, which is quite recent, and that's the Southland District Plan in relation to Stewart Island. I'm not familiar with any others that I am aware of at this point in time. However, I could look that up as well and provide a response with the mapping.
What in general sense does the Stewart Island one do, given that it is a remote island with one smaller settlement? Do you know
that one specifically looks at artificial lighting and glare, is my understanding.
Yes. Yes. Well, certainly I would appreciate some further examples from you with the Stewart Island case, and anything else you might care to reflect on around this mapping issue. One area that I am familiar with is the nature preservation zone in the Hastings District Plan, which is a special zone designed to around Cape Sanctuary, which you heard me talking to Mr. Taylor about. It does have some lighting provisions, but again, quite a remote area from light. So we just think about the context of Stewart Island, Cape Sanctuary, just with whatever we might provide. So yes, it's not the opportunity for any sort of broad-based supplementary evidence, but in response to those questions you've heard from us about the mapping, those examples, and any other thoughts you had in relation to these, the extent of your new proposed all of zone standard, that would be useful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Probably if you could put that together by the end of Wednesday and get that to Ms. Straker, that would be helpful.
Okay, I will do that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Right, I think, Ms. Newell, do you have any further summing up for the Director General's case?
Other than to say thank you for the opportunity to be heard. There was one question Commissioner Littlejohn asked about the definition of effects, and I have since looked that up and confirmed that it does refer to future effects in that definition in section 3C. And we will get that extra information to the hearing panel by the end of Wednesday. But, otherwise, thank you for the opportunity to be heard.
And thank you, Doc Team. It's certainly a very topical and very interesting area of new work. It's really is very interesting, and we're at the cutting edge of some of these things. So do appreciate your time and your effort and your advice. So thank you very much.
Kia ora.
Mr. Chair, would it be impertinent of me to ask for an opportunity just to clarify a few clarification questions of the Section 42A report writers, just on some of the issues I was discussing with the witness?
No, that's fine with me. If
okay, is Ms. Jane available, or Mr. Wesley? Is it?
Yes, I'm available.
Oh, cool. I just want to clarify, when you say the lux limit is expressed in both the horizontal and the vertical planes, can you just describe that to me? I think I know what it means, but I don't want to misunderstand that.
So my understanding, obviously not being a light expert myself, is that when you measure it, the light source either vertically, say, you have light source here, have your measurement here, or if you have your light source here and you measure it at a horizontal or a vertical.
Okay. So a 10 lux within any residential zone, or 20 lux within the mixed use. Okay. So where would you do the measure? Where would you do that? I mean, if we're looking at the port, for example,
sure.
Where would you do the measurement to determine whether it's compliant with the standard?
I would do that from the receiving site. So if the receiving site was a residential site, I would do it from 1.5 meters inside the residential site boundary.
Okay, so, but that's not what the standard says. It says 20 lux within that zone.
Right.
So,
okay.
Is that what? I mean, that's what I understand it. Now, just clarifying that, if it's in the vertical direction, doesn't the zone go upwards forever, so that the vertical control doesn't really make a huge difference, does it? It will be at the edge of the zone where you've got to meet your 20 lux that will control the whole thing. Is that how you'd understand it?
That would make sense, yes. I can definitely clarify with council's enforcement team on that one as well.
Okay. I mean, I don't know what a 20 lux light is versus a 10 lux light. Is there anything, again, you could probably help us out with then? I'm just conscious of this notion of these massive spotlights turned up to the sky with the Caped Crusaders message on the clouds. Is there any advice you can get us around that?
I can certainly look into that for you, and again talk to council's enforcement officers about how they do that in practice.
I'd also be quite interested in, I mean, given the notion the department was talking about of the Kaitakis being recolonized with Taiko and Cook's petrol, the areas around there are predominantly rural, and so the effective lighting standard for, let's say, a new facility that was developed in the rural zone would be 10 lux. So let's say, for example, a new dairy farm, dairy shed went in, or potentially even a new production site for a well facility. would it need any specific infringement of the 10 lux limit to be able to establish? I guess that, because those are the sorts of things that I got the sense we were really concerned about. A very bright facility developing in a very dark area between the Kaitakis and the coast that would potentially distract the seabirds. And so I'd like to get a sense, and you can discuss it potentially with, and I know there are probably some others on the line right now who will be giving us evidence, albeit in the noise space and not the light space, but just to get a bit of a sense of whether that 10 lux limit actually imposes a real control on the luminosity or the night lighting for a new facility that might establish in those sort of rural areas.
Yeah, so off the top of my head, it would absolutely depend on how close to the boundary that, say, a well site would establish. So if it's a big rural area, a big rural site, and it establishes right in the middle, it could arguably be quite bright. I think that's perhaps where you mentioned the horizontal and the vertical planes, perhaps that's where that comes into play. But again, I will check with council's enforcement officers about how that's practically done.
Okay. All right, I'd appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's all I was interested in exploring. Thanks.
So just to stay there, Ms. Jane. So this vertical plane, we're not, one of the things about introducing the concept of habitat is what I'm hearing is that the habitat of the fauna that we're talking about is actually in the air and on land. So in terms of the vertical plane, it's not a site we're dealing with in a pure land use notion, are we?
Yeah, that would be my understanding as well.
So I do think this is a technical area, and I do feel that we would benefit from some technical expert advice on these questions about, how would you measure if we're dealing with this sort of habitat? Are there ways that through mapping or focusing on particular areas and sites, we might be able to more focus some provisions?
Sure.
And I wonder whether tomorrow morning when we reconvene, looking at your blank name there, Sarah Edwards, you could perhaps put to us a proposition about how we might best be able to receive that advice. Yes, and timing and who might do it, because it is quite a specialist technical area. And as I said to the doc team, we're on the edge of these sort of issues without too much precedent to go on.
That's right. It is a technical area of expertise, and I would need to do some asking around and see whether there are any experts that we could perhaps approach to help us with this issue. What I would reinforce is our first protocol would be going to talk with our enforcement team to see what advice they receive in these sort of situations, and that would be our starting point. So I will certainly go and ask some questions after this meeting today, and hopefully provide you with an answer as to where I get to.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, I think we're the end of today's.
Sorry, Commissioner, Mr. Ellerton has signalled he may wish to make a comment.
All right, yes, certainly, Damien.
Good afternoon. I'll try and shed a little light on the light issue. Obviously, first terrible pun of the day. So I worked for the district council back in 1994 to 98, and one of the roles there was measuring light. So there's a certain parallel with noise. Obviously, that's more of my speciality. So that terminology around the horizontal and the vertical measurement of light is really to understand. So light travels in straight lines, so it's very directional, unlike sound can have some more subtleties to it. So what that's referring to is really nuisance at somebody's house, at somebody's window. So is it, you know, in the same plane as the glass of the window that's being affected by the light? So that's where that terminology comes into. So you're just making sure that you're not getting not a false positive, a false negative reading of 10 lux or whatever the number is on your light meter. So it was just that sort of wording counters the situational receiving of light. So if you were living next to Yarrow Stadium, for instance, and on Maritahu Street, and your house happened to be about the same height as the light towers, then you'd probably measure in the vertical axis or the z-axis, because that's where the light is impinging against your windows. So it's quite situational, whereas another house might be not at the same height as the towers, but actually lower down, therefore the light is coming down, as Miss Jane pointed out earlier. So it's just to allow the person measuring it to get the received light as it affects that particular situation.
Okay.
That may or may not help.
No, that is helpful, just in terms of the origin of that terminology, and the fact that the enforcement people seem to be dealing primarily with complaints from individuals seeing lights on their residential properties.
So it's very situational.
Okay, thanks for that.
I mean, the one thing that, the one thing that we sort of lose sight of here is that we've got rules that have been designed to protect human amenity that we're now trying to co-opt and use to protect potential future species amenity. And I guess that's where, I mean, I'm all for that personally, but I just wonder whether we're using the right tool. I mean, for example, the light rules are all focused and fixed on a site-by-site basis, so that 100 people can potentially all go out there and emit light at 10 lux. But then presumably what that means cumulatively is that the whole group of emitters are effectively, well, I don't know, does light behave in the same way as noise? Does it increase exponentially? I mean, if you get 10 people emitting 10 lux, does that somehow create a much, I mean, I don't know. I mean, if we're thinking about controlling the overall brightness of New Plymouth City, then you need to have an overall accumulative measure, don't you? That you sort of say, we're not going to let the city get any brighter than this.
Well, yeah, that's traversing a whole bunch of issues. But my first reaction is yes, light is energy, and energy adds logarithmically. So 10 lux and 10 lux is 13 lux, and 10 lots of 10 lux is 20 lux. And so it would add in that way. Similar analogy with noise, you know, would you be in a situation whereby you're in the center and there's 10 people all emitting the same amount of noise to you as a receiver? It's pretty unlikely, or maybe fanciful. And the same thing perhaps with light from a human perspective. I think your comment about the wider you know, the issues that Doc have raised and so forth are important, and yeah, whether or not they're dealt with in the plan as written, I'm not at liberty to say or have an opinion on, but certainly those lux levels, a bit like noise levels, are designed for a human response, and perhaps the numbers are different for different species. We have different noise limits, if you like, for aquatic species, and within the aquatic species there's you know, different thresholds there, so it's gets quite complicated. The lux levels in the rural area are at the notional boundary from memory. And I think I'll talk to that tomorrow in my evidence regarding the noise stuff. There's a singular comment in my evidence about that.
I think to some extent these issues are accommodated in a way between the standard and between the guidelines that Mr. Sidney's referred us to, because they're all very practical things around minimizing light spill, which you would hope that people would do anyway. And I guess the bit that's missing is a standard which is a guideline and encourages people to do things versus a standard which says if you're going to have outdoor lighting, it needs to be screened, or if you have outdoor lighting, you need to have it shielded and pointed downwards, and all of those sorts of things that are attached to Mr. Sydney's evidence. Sorry, Mr. Taylor's evidence. So yeah, okay, all right. Thank you for letting me explore that, Mr. Allerton.
Can I just raise a comment? The Twizel Mackenzie Basin area has a night sky reserve, which has been developed for nature, for tourism purposes, where people out of Europe and places like that who never get to see stars can actually see decent nighttime stars. Plus, they've got the Mount John Observatory there, so there may well be a range of standards around the lighting setup for that region on how to manage vertical impacts of lighting, because that is the issue. They want the light to be downward directed rather than upwards, so that people can actually see a dark night sky, so that the council may be able to refer to what are the rules in the Mackenzie Basin as a guide.
Yeah, that did spring to mind as well when I was looking at examples. All right, well, I think we've gone about as far as we can, and I think in the spirit of getting good information, I really appreciate all of the witnesses, and certainly Damien, your advice with your experience is good too, but we'll hear back from Sarah and Erica tomorrow about sort of technical advice, whether it's by way of a statement of explanation or something in that matter, and when it can be provided, that would be useful. So Julie, I think we are at the end for today. We'll be reconvening tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, is that right?
That's correct.
And how are people generally feeling about the Zoom process? Are there any concerns or any comments about how we're managing things? See a few thumbs up around the place. Okay, well, I think we've done pretty well, as my observation, and I thank you for contributing as you have. So we'll see some of you tomorrow morning. Thank you very much. Kit's got a final saying. Oh, he's waving. All right, goodbye.